Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here. The book that my colleague Joseph Koerner has just written, Art in a State of Siege, comes out at a moment, I don't think you necessarily calculated this, but comes out at a moment in which the experience of siege, at least in my world, is intense. So that there's a particular force and relevance to the very notion of thinking about what it's like to produce or to encounter works of art at moments of siege. But we'll find out more about this because I'm going to ask Joseph to begin with by telling us a little bit about what his book is about.
Well, thank you. And I apologize on such a bright and beautiful day to be speaking of some gloomy moments, but I hope there's also some bright spots in it. Could we have the PowerPoint, please? I'm going to be showing some images. We art historians can't survive without images. So I'll start while the PowerPoint hopefully goes up. The book is about art in extreme states, and the extreme states of collective human experience is siege. And when we think about siege, we probably first think of a military situation in which an enemy power tries to besieges a stronghold, a city or a fortress, in order to invade it, either by breaking down the walls or by undermining the walls or by just waiting it out, which is what the word siege comes from, to sit there and wait. Meanwhile, inside the city walls, of course, chaos ensues. Could we try and have the PowerPoint?
Or I'll do that. Aha.
There. Oh, actually, that's not the beginning. We want to go back to the beginning. The first slide.
I don't think it's going to happen.
We have to restart it. So sieges are there have been sieges since the beginning of human history. There has been no city without an enemy, and there has been no city, therefore, without walls. In the Chinese character for city is actually a representation of walls. And in Europe, in Germany, for example, the definition of a city is that which has walls. We know that sieges are collective points of trauma. Homer and the Bible both focus on a siege. In the case of Homer, the siege of Troy gives the Homeric cycle its focus. And the Bible, again and again, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, talks about the siege of Jerusalem as a kind of collective trauma. And in Deuteronomy, you learn by God demanding of his people what will happen if they don't follow his orders. Siege will come, and he describes siege as this condition in which not only is there an enemy outside, but more terribly, the people inside the city walls become enemies of each other. Families turn against each other, and in a terrible line of Deuteronomy, mothers eat their own children, and they eat the afterbirth and are jealous of that food for the rest of their family. So sieges are this terrible event, but I'm going to be talking about that, but also about a different kind of siege, which comes about as a term much later in human history, in which a government decides that the people within its walls are, or at least part of them, are the enemy. And they use the laws of siege to suppress internal opposition, to suppress what they would describe as civil war or insurrection. And they often use the law in order to achieve this state of siege. In French legal theory of the French Revolution, this kind of siege was called a fictive or political siege, because it wasn't a real military siege. It was a fiction for the purpose of pursuing politics, pursuing governance through the loophole in the law that allowed, under certain circumstances, the ruler to break all laws for as long as the ruler decided to do so. This idea of the siege is probably the more present in my book, which spans about 500 years of art history, but focuses in on three artists, Hieronymus Bosch, whose monstrous portrayal of what happens after a siege when you lose is represented here in the upper right of Hieronymus Bosch's so-called Garden of Delights. This picture is the opening of the book, and it's probably the most enigmatic painting ever painted in European art. No one agrees on what it fundamentally says, and the disagreement is of a profound kind. Not only what the subject is, but whether the work of art is for you or against you, whether it's an enemy or a friend. And it was painted at a time right before the Reformation, at the eve of the great religious wars which were about to break out. There's already a premonition of that, and there's also a premonition about problems with power and violence. It was painted in a garrison town in the Netherlands, and I think reflects that. I tell the story of these works of art often by the career of the image, what happens to the image over time. And the story of the Garden of Delights by Hieronymus Bosch brings me to a particular chapter in its history when, around the end of World War II, Germans became fascinated by Hieronymus Bosch because they seemed to see it as possibly their own future once they would be defeated. So the era around 1947, but even preceding that in Germany, is one of the frameworks of my understanding of Bosch. And so I began to work on a work of art which actually hangs right next door to where I teach. It's Max Beckmann's amazing self-portrait, which he painted in 1927. It shows him as a statesman, and it was painted during a time in which Germany was governed mostly by emergency law, and in which the problem of emergency law as a legal construction was heavily debated. And out of that world of debate of what it means to be ruled by a lawless form of law, this painting was painted. But I take my title from the third person I work on and the third work of art, the South African artist William Kentridge. Kentridge was a young artist in 1985, in the year when apartheid South Africa declared what would become a permanent state of siege until the end of apartheid. And in these conditions, he coined the phrase of what he felt himself to be in a world in which freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and a radically rotten form of law, a form of law in which the white minority kept its power by basically usurping the power of the Constitution. And he did this silkscreen as his illustration of what he meant by art in a state of siege. And it became part of a triptych in which he tried to represent what would be three phases of art. Phase number one is art in a state of grace, by which he means something like a world like Impressionism or a world in which art can be beautiful and you can breathe a sigh of relief. But he says, we can't do this under these dire circumstances. And so he said, what about art in a state of hope? And what he meant by that, mainly, what he had in mind was art of the Soviet revolution, in which there were a utopia in which art could change things for the better. And he said, we don't even have that. We don't have art in a state of hope. What we do have is art in a state of siege. And in art in a state of siege, as he puts it, optimism has to be kept at check, and nihilism has to be kept at bay. Optimism in check, nihilism in bay. And he produced this wonderful triptych to illustrate those different forms of art.
Now, maybe what you have seen already, of course, is probably the most famous triptych probably ever painted at the beginning, that painting by Bosch. And now, after the interlude of Beckmann, we see this other triptych. So maybe we should start there and talk about this form, this strange form of three different works attached to each other and yet not quite the same.
Yes, yes. So it wasn't actually until I had finished the book, more or less, that someone reminded me that my book is a triptych. It's about three artists, and all three are great innovators in the triptych form. The triptych was originally a form for Christian altarpieces. You could open and close them. You could tell stories with the triptych, and you could also bring together disparate material. And so Kentridge took the triptych format, but he borrowed it actually directly from Max Beckmann. Max Beckmann was to Kentridge the avatar of art in a state of siege because of Beckmann's relationship to the Nazi regime. But William Kentridge liked the triptych form because in it, and you can see this in a Beckmann triptych, you have continuity because you have three things put up together and you have to wonder why these three things as opposed to two things or one thing, or why not spread them out? They must mean something. So it expresses continuity, but it allows you to have discontinuity and allows the viewer to have to make sense of the ensemble themselves. It brings in the viewer, the three-part format. And so if I reach back to Hieronymus Bosch's so-called Garden of Delights, I say so-called because there's no title that comes to us from the historical period. It just was called Garden of Delights at the end of the 1800s. But this picture is a triptych. It was built this way, and you can see that it also brings together these three parts under one horizon. You've got the same sky, same horizon, that high horizon on the three panels, but you can see it gets very bad in the end. Now we can make sense of the triptych in its beginning form, which is on the far left, which is the scene of Adam and Eve. What part of the story of Adam and Eve is very complicated, but it's Adam and Eve being brought together by God in the Garden of Eden. So let's just say, for an abbreviation, there's a beginning, right? At the other end of the triptych is a scene of hell, imagined as a siege that has been lost, with all sorts of bizarre episodes. And so the viewer has to ask themselves, how do I get from here to there? How do I get from paradise to hell, from bliss to damnation, from pleasure to pain? And in between lies this panel that no one agrees on. And I'm saying no one agrees on, that every interpreter has tried to interpret it, makes a claim as to what it represents. But to this day, I get books and articles from people telling me, now I don't like your view. This is my view, and here I finally solved it. No one agrees on the central panel.
When did you first see this painting? And what did you think it was when you first saw it?
I first saw it in a book that my father rescued from the ruins of, oddly enough, of a building in Berlin when he was there with the U.S. Army in 1946. And he rescued a book, and it was in my childhood book library, and I used to open it up, and then it became, when I became an art historian, it's the most puzzling work in the history of art. And therefore, it was always a challenge what to do with this work. And when I say puzzling, it means usually you wonder what something means. Does it mean salvation? Does it mean, is that figure supposed to be a Christ figure, or is it supposed to be a figure of the Virgin? Is it a myth? Is it a folklore? In this case, we don't know what are all these nude people doing and what are they doing with us. Are they, in other words, good things? Is it nice what's going on? It seems nice. Or are they bad things? Are they things that are damning? Is that the reason why we're moving from paradise to hell, is because in between something bad is going on? But the literature is completely divided between whether we're supposed to say that the center is good or the center is bad. I like to say, is the picture for you or against you? Is Bosch a painter of friends, or is Bosch a painter of enemies? And so that makes the triptych format really interesting because it mobilizes our questions.
Can we at least be secure about the first panel, that is to say, the much more familiar panel of Adam and Eve being brought together in the
Yes.
garden?
So everything about this picture, as is the case generally with this peculiar artist, Hieronymus Bosch, who dies in 1516, so right before the Reformation. He does everything recognizable but with some strange feature, and the most strange feature is, what is the episode going on here? It isn't the fall of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve eat the apple. It's not the creation of Eve, although I think it's partly related to Eve's creation. It's also not the marriage of Adam and Eve, but it's the moment, I think, and actually I think I have a good slide of it, it's the moment in which Adam looks at Eve for the first time, because the story is that Adam was put to sleep, and in this operation, under general anesthesia, as it were, a rib is removed, and Eve is created. And she's kneeling, as Eve often does in pictures of her being born, and Adam opens his eyes, he sees her, and he flushes. His cheeks grow nice and rosy. And he looks over at Eve, and something is happening in him, which is, I think, the point, the picture's moment. The picture's moment and beginning point is the moment in which Adam opens his eyes, looks at Eve, and then the story starts, and the problem is, what is the story?
Can you stop for 1/2 a second and just, if 2 slides ago, and you can see it here in this one, is that a cat carrying a mouse?
Yes, so there are, as they say, trouble is in paradise. There are, I mean, the more you look at it, the more troubling it becomes. There are, for example, frogs being born from the sludge. And according to medieval lore, the worst thing that could happen is parthenogenesis, creatures being born not through ordinary sexual reproduction, but by some kind of self-created slime. And there are toads of that kind. Plus, animals are supposed to be vegetarian in paradise, and there is clearly not a vegetarian activity going on. So there's already corruption, and there's this very ominous, much discussed, but still, I think, worthy of head-scratching owl, a symbol of evil in the period, staring out at us from the geometric center of the picture, right there in the dark hole, which you see above Christ. So Christ is looking at us, that dark hole is looking at us, and the owl is looking at us too, asking us, what do we do? What do we think? What are we doing when we're looking at the picture? Because we're staring at the picture, maybe blushing ourselves, just like Adam is staring at Eve. That's the starting point, let's say, the moment off the starting point of the race.
So if that's the case, and if Adam is actually blushing, which is a strange thing to be doing if you're in paradise, not quite clear why he's blushing, what are we to make of the direction that we're going in the painting? Assuming we start there with this,
yes,
this problem.
Yes.
A cat eating a mouse in paradise? A man blushing at the sight of a naked woman in paradise?
Yes.
Though, where are we to go with this?
Yes. So I had the great pleasure of actually teaching Adam and Eve with my fellow speaker, Stephen, for several years. And one of the things that one, in the huge, long, thousands of years of discussion about Adam and Eve, is that there's general agreement, and there was in the Christian tradition, that Adam had to possess some form of libidinal, some form of desire, because it was part of creation in the book of Genesis that Adam and Eve were supposed to be fruitful and multiply. And in fact, all species, plants and animals, are supposed to self-seed. Creation is over once Eve is created. That's the last act of the biblical God, is in terms of creation, is the creation of Eve. So at the moment in which the human is supposed to take over, it makes sense that he might open his eyes and feel a desire to be fruitful and multiply. The problem is that the Middle Ages, also in the aftermath of Christian understanding of this story, was that there was a sense that, and it's also in the story, that something happened with desire between the moment at which Adam and Eve are created, where they are naked but don't know it, to the moment after they've trespassed, eaten the apple, eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They see that they are naked, and all of a sudden something has happened to their desire. Something has happened also to their actual visual experience of the world. So I think what Bosch is trying to represent is the moment in which a first desire, an original desire, is being aroused, but one which will turn out in the long run to be a disastrous desire, but isn't yet a disastrous desire. I like to think of it as a nanosecond. Bosch is thinking not in terms of minutes or hours or days for this story to unfold. It's the nanosecond of opening your eyes, seeing something, getting excited by it, and then possibly, and now I will admit this is much more my interpretation than one that we could take it or leave it, but if you send the line from Adam's eyes through the picture, you end up with this monstrous tree man who bears Adam's features at the far end, looking back as if sadly of the whole horrible history of humanity, back through the central panel.
But wait a second, what does whatever is going on in the middle of the central panel I think it looks like fun, but it's a peculiar form of fun.
Right.
What does it have to do with siege?
Siege, okay, yeah. Well, clearly at the first level of things, the picture ends up with what I describe as the dire form of human experience, a scene of hell, of damnation, of eternal pain, represented as the time in which the cities have fallen and the enemy, here the devils, have come in and are now permanently torturing and endlessly giving pain to the people who once inhabited the city of Earth. So siege in the aftermath is at the end. And so the question is, what does the center have to do with siege? And my view of it, and it comes from the fact that, partly, the fact that if you were to see this triptych with the eyes of a person of the time, the first thing you would have thought of is that this is a last judgment. Because to have heaven on one side, or paradise on one side, and hell on the other side, was the typical way to show that the last judgment is upon us and terrible things are going to happen. But in this case, there is no last judgment. There's no God at the center. There's a puzzle. And my view of it is that the picture shows what it means to be besieged by something that causes us to have a desire that will bring about our downfall. And I think that Bosch paints a painting which is itself a cause for downfall, because there's no painting as bright, as brilliantly colored, as engaging, and also as peculiarly at the edge of erotic art in the history of European art until this picture. It stands out from any other painting of the time with its pink and blue colors, and also with hundreds of nudes at the center of this picture. So the siege is one which I think comes as a result of our experience. It throws the meaning of the picture, throws the experience of the picture onto the viewer, and it besieges the viewer like Eve, I think, besieged Adam at the first moment of viewing. Now I say this, and there's a lot of skepticism, but when one looks at the career of this image, which is as colorful as the picture is, so too is the history of this painting. After it was painted, as it came into the hands of collectors, violent men, the Duke of Alba came to the Netherlands, and the first thing he wanted to do before subjugating the Netherlands was to get this painting. He wanted to have the Garden of Delights. And he tortured the person who held it, the concierge, until he got it for himself. And then it's brought to Philip II of Spain, when Philip is ruling over the world divided by religious war between the Protestants and the Catholics, and he's colonializing the New World. And he uses this picture also for his own way of thinking. And as we move through history, people have responded to this work in ways that have to do with how they understand themselves as much as what the picture is about. So my view is that Bosch produced a work that aggressively attacks the senses, and particularly attacks the sense of sight, and makes you wants something and tells you, though, where you're going. Because there's no question what the sentence says. You go from point A to point B to point C, and point C is catastrophe. So something is happening that's catastrophic. You're under siege, and then the hell scene tells you where it's going to end.
So if I understand you, your own obsession with the painting is a sign of being under siege, and also anyone in this room who's looking at the painting is in effect participating in some way or other, if they're looking at all,
yes,
in this siege experience.
Yes, because for one thing, I mean, I could find personal aspects to it, but there are about 40 figures in the painting looking straight out at you, casually looking out at you from the picture, including Christ, including the owl there. So the picture is already looking at you before you look at it. Now, if I had more time, I would show that Bosch shows again and again this condition that the painting sees you, and what it sees in you is that you are damned. That's what Bosch's pictures often programmatically say. I see you, I know you're a sinner, you're going to hell. This painting makes it more complicated because it sees you, but it doesn't let you know, it doesn't quite give us a portrait of where you're going except in the end. And I think when we look at, we know a bit about where the work hung, and it actually was, it was a work that was owned and probably commissioned by a very violent, important nobleman, the Count of Nassau, and then he showed visitors this picture. He didn't tell them its title, it turns out, because we know from a description that the person can't make sense of it. This diplomat from Italy can't make sense of the picture, but he says, you have to see it to believe it. And so the picture draws you in. I think the owner wanted you to be drawn in and possibly be titillated, but also be admonished and maybe also embarrassed, because he was a person who was known to be quite rude to his guests. And so you're given this picture and you try and make sense of it. But I would say that the minute you look at it, you know you're being looked at. Bosch wants you to do that. And if you go to the Prado in Madrid, where this picture hangs, you know where it is because there's huge crowds of people always around it. It's like the Mona Lisa, except the Mona Lisa people go and they photograph themselves. The Garden of Delights, they might photograph themselves, but then they get trapped and endlessly, you have to push your way forward. It traps you in its beauty.
And is the same experience somehow comparable in the other paintings that you were looking at?
Well, I think that there is a way in which all of them are works that engage you in a very aggressive and a way that makes you need to think. And that's in a sense what happens with these works. They're all works which are produced in states of siege, but also then they enter into a long history in which they keep on popping up.
What kind of state of siege was this produced
Okay, so
in?
Beckmann's self-portrait was painted at a point in German history between the end of the First World War, which ended disastrously for Germany, and the coming to power of Hitler in 1933. And during this period, the fledgling democracy hardly really could function because for scores of times, the government, the president, would declare a state of exception or a state of emergency, such that the rule of law was over. And it's under that condition eventually that Adolf Hitler took power and was able to rule Germany until 1945 as a permanent state of exception. So Beckmann was very in touch with the traumatic effects of World War I. He made his career by representing war trauma, literally the war wounded, as well as psychological trauma in his own expressive painting. But in this painting, he painted a representation of himself, and we have a document because he wrote a long manifesto about this painting, in which he says that artists should become the rulers of the state. They should become the statesmen. They will be the ones who decide on this chaotic emergency. And I'm going to dress up because I'm going to make a decision for Europe, what Europe should be. It's going to be the artists, and that's why he's dressed in the tuxedo. When I show this painting to visitors and students, I love the fact, irrespective of all what I'm talking about, the fact that the cigarette is always burning in his hand. So it's like time is ticking. I'm talking about it, you're looking at it, your view is as good as mine. But time is ticking, but he's saying that I'm making this decision right now, and you see the decider. The artist is going to be the Führer, the leader. It was an idea right before actually Hitler came into power, the artist as leader, der Künstler als Führer. And Beckmann styles as that. And I show this picture on the right because, in fact, what happens is that the painting is bought by the German state. A room is built for Max Beckmann in the National Museum. He's declared the German artist. So in some sense, it becomes the case that Beckmann becomes the leader of Germany until Hitler comes, and then Hitler decides that Beckmann and all his type are actually the enemies of the people, that they are the enemy because of the modernism, the cosmopolitanism, also because of Jewish patrons and Jewish critics. And so I'm showing here on the right that almost immediately the work was taken down, put into a depot. Works like it were then displayed for mockery in a famous exhibition called Degenerate Art and Art der Kunst, with art in quotation marks. And it was in that period, from that moment in which you see the work just in the depot, that my institution, Harvard University, purchased the work for $300, which I know there's inflation, but $300 was, normally paintings like that would be many, many thousands of dollars. So a very cheap price through a Swiss dealer. So this kind of represents, I think, something of the character of the book, maybe better than I've been trying to do, which is it's partly about the works of art made in states of siege, for states of siege, but it's also what becomes of works of art. It's their career, it's the physical object in its history, in its career. And what these works demonstrate, and Beckmann's case is particular, is that Beckmann thought that he was the one who was going to decide, but he was decided on, and he and his fellow expressionist, modernist artists came into siege. Many of them emigrated. Beckmann went into exile in Amsterdam. Many were killed. Many of the works were destroyed. Beckmann's picture happened to survive, and Beckmann did too. Beckmann picture right next door to me.
Let me ask you this, Joseph. I mean, all three of the artists that your book is about, you say painted in situations of tension or duress or pressure. In the case of Kentridge, under apartheid, here under the decline of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazism, and in the case of Bosch, the years just before Europe falls apart from the Reformation. So I don't know what the equivalent is in India, for example, but we know that the world is full of moments in which art is under pressure, artists are under pressure. Either they can't do anything at all, or actually what they produce is produced in some sense in relation to the pressure that they're under. I happen to be a great admirer of the Iranian filmmaker Kiarostami, who is producing films in incredible circumstances under enormous pressure from the state. And we know that there are multiple cases of this. I'm also, I love the novels that Milan Kundera wrote in the years under the pressure from Czechoslovakia. We know that Solzhenitsyn wrote important novels that way. The world is full of this kind of moment in which artists have to produce. Is that actually what this vision is, that art actually, if you put enough pressure on it and the artists are brave enough, they will actually heighten their artistic production? Is this true for Bosch or for Beckmann or for Kentridge?
Yes, I think in each of the cases, there's very little wiggle room for what you would imagine, very little room to maneuver. That is, Bosch has a certain artistic freedom, but right around the corner, a few years after his death, art itself will be besieged. by the iconoclasts. Most of Northern European art in Bosch's region will be destroyed in the ensuing decades. So he's right at the edge of a moment in which the tables are going to be turned and somebody who paints enemies, like Bosch does, becomes an enemy. So there's a lot of tension, and in that tension, I think a lot of opportunity for what the artist can do, which other people can't do, come to the fore. So Bosch is able to foresee iconoclasm, while at the same time foresee image breaking, foresee the rage that was unleashed on Christian images by the Protestants. He could foresee that, and he could, in a way, paint a painting, as I argue, which pushes so far what a work of art can do that it almost becomes an idol itself. He's playing at that edge between what is possible and what is not possible. In Beckmann's case, I think it's this weird wavering, which the painting, if you look at it, says. On the one hand, Beckmann is saying, I am the leader. I am dressed in a tuxedo like a statesman. I belong here. Maybe we don't even belong as much as he belongs. But you can see that programmatically he places a shadow, this amazing chiaroscuro, which goes right through his body. If you see the real painting, you see that it's not just dark and light, but part of the painting is painted in shiny, oily pigments, and the shadow that goes through is matte. So you want to see him shimmering. You don't know, is this a dream? Is this going to work out, or is this not going to work out? For me, Kentridge was very useful to answer that question, because he is a contemporary artist who writes about this thing. And he had a very famous, his father in South Africa is probably more famous than he. Sir Sidney Kentridge was probably the most distinguished lawyer for the anti-apartheid activists. And he watched as his father tried to use the law in the face of a lawless state, tried to find areas in the Constitution in which he could protect the rights of particularly the black minority. And each time his father tried to do this, the law would change and people would be arrested. And so Kentridge, as a young man, thought, I need something that gives me some space but isn't the law, because I see that it's ineffective, and can't be politics because political parties were illegal under apartheid South Africa. So there were no elections, there were no, you couldn't mobilize, you couldn't march, and you certainly couldn't be in opposition. So where was this wiggle room? Art was this world in which, sort of like Beckmann, things are ambiguous, but in that ambiguity, in that small space, you're able to do things which at that moment could be done in no other vehicle, no other language. So it may be, as you say, Stephen, that having a very narrow space, having constriction, is always good for art. I mean, in your field, sonnets are something in which you want it to be compressed. But every work of art has its frame. Every work of art has its limitations. And in this case, the limitations are political, legal, maybe deeper, spiritual as well. But they are certainly political and legal limitations. And in that world, the aesthetic, the sphere of the aesthetic of what an artist can do has a capacity that is very unique. And I think it's also important that the works that I bring forward are ones that, especially in the case of Bosch, it's not just that Bosch was working in this dangerous time, but in dangerous times, people look at Bosch and think they have an answer. They look at all this cryptic symbolism, and they're different kinds of people. The main figure is this Nazi legal theorist, Carl Schmitt, who looks at the work in prison for war crimes in 1947 in Nuremberg, and he conjures in his head, he actually has probably a book in his cell. He looks at the Garden of Delights and says, that's my predicament. I am being surrounded by lawless, libertine liberals.
I mean, putting libertine and liberals aside, it is the case, and maybe this speaks to an American more than it will speak to you, that many of you in the audience, this book appears at a moment in which our constitutional world seems to be crumbling.
Yes. Yes.
What's the meaning of the book appearing, of these, why you're choosing these objects at this moment in 2026, when we have a a leader who seems to be indifferent to the law when we have unbelievable pressure on our existing system. Do the works look different? Does this work look different to you when you look at Max Beckmann, or you look at Kentridge, or Bosch for that matter?
I think when I started to work on it, in this sense, it's useful by being a teacher because I can watch what's happening with students. And when I started to teach Bosch, and I did because of the legal conditions and the historical circumstances of these different works, I discussed the problem of when democracy fails and how strong in the United States our Constitution is. But it was very, I had to get students to read things and imagine a world in which, you know, you had a president who decided that they are actually literally above the law, or digged back into history, as is happening this week, of finding the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act from the 1870s in the United States is a classic case of what one would call a legal loophole, which creates the possibility of a state of siege. You say, if I call the person an that insurrection, then I can use the force of my military, not just the police, but the military, to treat my own citizens as enemies. That's a classic case. So in answer to your question, what happened was that what took a kind of lot of instruction and historical research and making people imagine what it might be like is now the everyday. I mean, in a sense, I feel that the book is relevant. In another sense, I wish I had written a happier book.
Yes. Because
the fact is that I now want to read about art that's more comforting and that is consoling. Where this is not art that consoles. It's art that worries you, that puts you into the absolute uncertainty as to how things are going to turn out.
We have to, I'm afraid, bring this to a close, but I hope that this book, which at the moment seems horribly timely, will, after a relatively short while, seem, well, it's an interesting moment.
Hopefully.
Back.
I hope it becomes irrelevant.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joseph.